When you want to catch a Pokemon, you need to battle and weaken it first. This is one of the first things taught to us in basically every Pokemon game, and it's completely wrong. With advancements in Pokeball technology and a little bit of luck, it's no trouble to regularly catch Pokemon without a struggle. But we can go even further than this. You don't even need to use your own Pokemon to catch another. And this has been true since the very first games, Red, Blue, Green, and Yellow. That's right. I'm talking about the Safari Zone, the legendary staple of the first 4 generations, where rare Pokemon wander around just waiting to be caught. There are 4 true Safari Zones, one in Kanto, Johto, Hoenn, and Sinnoh. Sort of. The most recent time we saw one was an updated version of the Great Marsh in 2021's Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. The last new one we received was in 2009's Heart Gold and Soul Silver. That's a rough thought. If you really think about it though, Pokemon Go, Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, and even Legends Arceus sort of take the Safari Zone's principles and make entire games of them. That's probably why I like them so much. A true Safari Zone though has just 3 concrete rules. You cannot battle the Pokemon within them, you have 30 special Safari Balls to catch Pokemon with, and the Pokemon can flee from you. There's been some variance across the years to other things, but these 3 core tenets remained the same. Today, I thought I'd explore the places that meet these requirements, and then some honorable mentions. After that, I'll share some thoughts on the future of the Safari Zones. Let's begin. It all started on the Game Boy in the Kanto region. The Safari Zone is located in Fuchsia City. It's a necessary stop on your journey across Kanto. Actually, this is the only time the player is required to enter a Safari Zone on their journey to the Pokemon League. Inside the zone, there are 2 items required to beat the game. A hidden prize and a lost item we exchange for something more useful. You can hear about the special prize promotion ahead of time by talking to some NPCs. Before we enter, if we go to talk to the Safari Warden to get some more information, he has some interesting stuff to say.
Hif huff, hiffy foo, ha love, ha fif, ha huffy ho, hif fwe.
If you say no, he says,
Huh? Here, he, ha hu, he.
If you say yes,
A ho, he, ho, hoo. If, he, ha, halfway ho.
Very insightful stuff. If you talk to some of the townsfolk who know him and look around a bit, the reason for the man's unintelligibility becomes clear. The warden, nicknamed Slowpoke for his vacant expression, has false teeth. Only recently have people become unable to understand him. The conclusion that we're supposed to draw is that he's lost his false teeth somewhere, in the Safari Zone, if you hadn't already guessed. So heading into the Safari Zone, it's expected that we're loosely aware of both a special prize and a lost item. 2 more staples of the Safari Zone are intended to impede your progress here. There's an entrance fee of 500 Pokédollars, and you have only 500 or 600 steps depending on which version of Kanto you're playing before your time is up. You can do a little bit of this maneuver to get into encounters while not taking steps. It's intended that you take multiple trips to accomplish all you need to, but with careful preparation and a walkthrough, you can obtain the Gold Teeth and the Surf HM in one go. I do recommend using a walkthrough because there are so many items lying around at the Safari Zone that, without direction, it can feel like you're a baby crawling around in a jangly key factory. That isn't even mentioning the available Pokemon here, which are also a big reason to go to the Safari Zone. It's home to all sorts of Pokemon like Nidoran, the Paris line, and even Dratini and Dragonair. Believe it or not, in Generation 1, the only Pokemon exclusive to the Safari Zone was Execute. Every other Pokemon that can be found here can either be found in the wild elsewhere or through in-game trades and the Game Corner in at least one version of the games. Which, if you didn't know, there's a lot of weird variants in the first generation, especially if you look at the Japanese versions. Generation 3's depiction is a lot more protective of which Pokemon go where, with Pokemon like Tauros, Kangaskhan, Rhyhorn, and Chansey being exclusive to the zone. Chansey is probably the most famous Safari Zone Pokemon. It's incredibly difficult to find, let alone catch. Because to reiterate, in the Safari Zone, Pokemon can flee, and you cannot weaken them. Each species of Pokemon has its own flee rate to go along with its catch rate. Your options are to throw a rock, bait, or a Pokeball. The ball is self-explanatory. A rock makes a Pokemon easier to catch, but more likely to flee. Bait does the opposite. It's more complicated than it sounds though, and sometimes baiting a Pokemon actually makes it easier to catch, depending on the version. In Gen 1, a Pokemon's flee chance is determined by its speed stat. In Generation 3, they each have their own independent flee stat. If you want to know more, here are some tutorials I've linked below for the Kanto Zone. Essentially though, in the Gen 3 Kanto Zone, each Pokemon has a statistical best route for catching it involving a pattern of balls, bait, and rocks. It's not a guarantee or anything, but it can give you an edge. To my knowledge, the first documented shiny Safari Zone Chansey was caught in 2017, and people had been trying for years before then. There's still only a handful of these cases in 2025, if that gives you an idea of how difficult Chansey is to catch. In Generation 3, there's an extra element to Chansey's infuriating nature. Wild Chansey are the only renewable source of lucky eggs in Generation 3, an extremely useful held item that increases the amount of XP a Pokemon gets from battling. You have about a 5% chance to find a Chansey under ideal conditions, and around an 18% chance to catch one if you use an optimized bait strategy. Each Chansey you see has a 5% chance to have a lucky egg as a held item. That all comes out to about a 1 in 2500 chance to find and catch a Chansey with a lucky egg per encounter. If you don't feel like doing that though, there is a gift lucky egg in Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness. When I got a lucky egg from a Chansey for myself in this video, it took me 8,037 encounters and I found 2 shiny Pokemon before I did. Check that video out if you want some more in-depth coverage of the lucky egg phenomenon. Kanto's Safari Zone is unique in that there are rest areas in which you can speak to various NPCs who are on safari just like you are. Other Safari Zones do have people, they're just far less populated. It really feels in the Kanto games that people are trying earnestly to receive the promotional prize at the end. They've got interesting things to say, like this man who talks about evolutions. At this point in the game, you probably have picked up an Eevee on your way to get a drink for the gate guards. If you're playing blind and have no idea what to do with an Eevee, this man gives you an indirect hint at the choices available to you. I love NPCs like this. A good deal of them just talk about how tired they are though. Reaching the secret house at the western end of the Safari Zone rewards the player with a Surf HM, which not just makes it possible to go to Cinnabar Island, but also to traverse more quickly around the Safari Zone. It's a necessary tool in preserving your step count on future visits. The gold teeth are not too far away from the secret house. Let's actually talk a little bit about the teeth. How did the warden accidentally drop them? He isn't senile or anything, despite being an old guy with no teeth. We see him in later installments doing quite well for himself. Independently too. I think it's reasonable that he likely lost his false teeth after an encounter with a wild Pokemon in the zone. Where we retrieve the teeth is so close to the secret house that I imagine this was not too long after the Surf HM promotion was set up. The reason he hasn't retrieved them himself becomes apparent after we return the teeth to him. The warden was simply too embarrassed to talk to people. Him being the person who runs a significantly popular attraction meant that he would be forced to converse with patrons and employees, and so he cooped up in his house. He's so eager for the return of his teeth that he pops them in immediately. If you didn't know, it's not a good idea to put unclean things in your mouth. Then again, maybe a lack of common sense is how he lost his teeth in the first place. The warden then gives us our second Fuchsia City HM, Strength, which is needed for Victory Road. If you don't grab it here, you'll regret having to backtrack in your penultimate challenge. In Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee, the Safari Zone instead was developed as the Go Park, an area which allows for the transferring of Pokemon from Pokemon Go. Because the way you catch Pokemon in these games is so similar to the Safari Zone formula, where you can't battle to weaken them and they can flee, this was quite a creative way to utilize the unused space. In Heart Gold Soul Silver, the Safari Zone's popularity waned, and instead it was replaced by the Pal Park. It's run by the warden's son actually, and I don't know if that implies he runs the one in Sinnoh or not. The Kanto Safari Zone is one of the few areas that didn't return in Gold, Silver, and Crystal. There's a sign stating its closure because the warden is traveling abroad. It was planned and scrapped, likely for space-saving purposes. The original Generation 2 games crammed a lot into a tiny little cartridge. Through glitching, you can still visit the unused Safari Zone in a limited capacity. There isn't too much to see though, and Gen 2 doesn't really suffer from a lack of an explorable Safari Zone. The Johto region itself didn't get one until later, but we'll talk about that in a bit. First, let's head to the next one we got. The Hoenn Safari Zone is different enough from the original that despite sharing basically all of the qualities from the first, it feels fresh and stands on its own. There are a few key differences. The one I think is talked about the least is the flee rate. All of the Pokemon in the Hoenn Safari Zone have the exact same chances of fleeing. Actually, this uniformity isn't done in any other Safari Zone and is exclusive to Hoenn. In Kanto, for example, a Chansey is much more likely to flee than a Magikarp. That kind of makes sense, you can find Magikarp everywhere, it's not as rare. But in Hoenn, the coveted Miltank is just as skittish as the dreaded Oddish. The flee rate can also be manipulated through use of this region's bait substitute, Pokeblocks. In each area, there are Pokeblock feeders you can use to attract Pokemon of certain natures. Combine this with thrown Pokeblocks enticing Pokemon of specific natures to flee significantly less, and you can greatly reduce fleeing in the Hoenn Safari Zone. I'll link a helpful video about it down below. Basically, you force Pokemon to have a certain nature, and then you give them Pokeblocks that nature likes. Typically, I don't do it myself because it's a lot more reliable than Kanto's bait strat. If Kanto's is a strategy, Hoenn's is a manipulation. Even when shiny hunting here, I prefer a chance to flee. It's just more exciting for me, and I've lost some cool stuff in these zones, so believe me, I know what's at stake. Rather than throwing rocks at Pokemon to agitate them, you have the option to go nearer to them. As a mechanic, this saddens me. Combined with the flat flee chance, it really evokes the idea that the wild Pokemon here are particularly skittish. Perhaps at one point, throwing rocks was allowed in this zone, and this distrust of humans is the result. Not to say that rolling Throx in Kanto is justified, I think it's actually kind of weirdly off-brand and cruel, and it thankfully hasn't returned. Another thing that sets this zone apart is how you can very easily cheese the step counter to stay indefinitely. The Acro Bike, exclusive to the Hoenn games, can be used to hop in place and maintain your position while still allowing the potential for encounters. This makes it ideal for both things with step restrictions like repels for repel tricking and the Hoenn Safari Zone. That is, of course, unless you're playing a Japanese copy of Ruby or Sapphire. There exists a rare glitch in those versions where sustained use of bike hopping can cause the game to freeze. No such glitch exists in English. The Acro Bike is also useful for maneuvering around the Safari Zone, as there are areas only accessible by bike platforms and hop rocks. The Acro Bike's counterpart, the Mach Bike, can also be used to access parts of this zone. In the original Gen 3 games, you can only have one bike at a time, so 100%ing the Safari Zone will take a minimum of 2 trips with a detour to Rydals and Mauville City in between. Again, I'd recommend using a map while exploring, because it can be a little unintuitive. However, there aren't any items in here that you can't go on without. The Safari Zone is completely optional in Hoenn, and you're denied entry unless you grab the Pokeblock case at the Slateport City Contest Hall. Why don't we talk a little bit about the Hoenn Safari Zone's available Pokemon? Not a single one of them was introduced in the Hoenn region. A good number of them, the rare ones in particular, are instead from the Johto region. In Emerald, there are even more. Yes, in the post-game of Emerald, 2 new areas open up filled to the brim with interesting Pokemon. A fair amount, actually, are Pokemon that were intended to appear in Altering Cave. Altering Cave is an area present in Fire Red, Leaf Green, and Emerald where you can find Zubat, and not much else. You were supposed to be able to find Mareep, Aipom, Pineco, Shuckle, Teddiursa, Houndour, Stantler, and Smeargle here on a rotating basis using some sort of event, but that never panned out. I have no idea why they put it in Emerald after doing nothing with it in Fire Red and Leaf Green, especially when they put all of these Pokemon, save for Smeargle who's at the Battle Frontier, in the Safari Zone extension. The only potential reason I can think of is that the Pokemon in Altering Cave have unique held items that the Safari encounters lack, but again, they never did anything with the Altering Cave. Almost none of the Pokemon are 100% exclusive here, but it saves you the trouble of figuring out how to hook up your GBA to an obscure GameCube title. And yes, I consider Coliseum and XD to be obscure. I love them to death, but who the hell in the casual scene has even heard of them? Your little brother probably still thinks Love Disc evolves into a Lomomola. Something else I noted while exploring this place for footage was that the Safari Zone here in Hoenn has the 3 major types of water tiles. As far as I can tell, nowhere else in Hoenn has all 3 in one area. The Emerald Safari Zone has puddles, light blue reflective ponds, and running dark blue water. There's even a waterfall. The only ones missing are dive or current tiles, but they're essentially represented by the regular running tiles. I never noticed until now, and it's kind of weird to see the still tiles in the same area as the wavy ones. Now though, we need to talk about the Phanpy in the room. You've probably noticed I've been pretty deliberately just mentioning the Gen 3 version of the Safari Zone. That's because in Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the Safari game wasn't implemented. The zone is present, but as we'll cover in a little more depth later, it's not the name, it's the game that makes a Safari Zone. There's no entrance fee, there's no Safari Balls, and there's no step limit. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the Safari Zone is basically just a route with wild Pokemon to battle like every other patch of grass in Hoenn. It's incredibly disappointing as a Safari Zone fan, but I kind of like that they addressed it in game. You see, in the lobby, you can find a journal detailing the history of this continuity zone. It was originally a Safari game, as far as I can tell. There was an entrance fee, and it was incredibly popular. That's where the trouble started, though, because the owner got greedy and raised the prices. Patrons responded by no longer making the trip for a Safari game, and the owner resorted to fleeing the country to escape bankruptcy. The zone was then reimagined and reborn, so the owner returned to volunteer and take care of Pokemon after the heat died down. As much as I dislike the lack of a Safari game within the zone, I do really like this explanation for why there isn't one. It's a little more egregious than the cases of Unova and Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee though. Unova was simply a break from tradition in many ways. The main mechanics of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are so similar to the Safari game, it seems kind of redundant to have an area like the Safari Zone. There's not really a similar excuse for Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire. They're based on a game that had a Safari game, and it's fairly faithful except for this. I will say that I do like how they've redesigned the place to be more bike dependent. It feels sort of like a skate park, and it incentivizes you to do the new side quest to have both bikes at once. When X and Y came out and the player had roller skates to get around with, I thought it was an excellent touch to put skate parks and similar areas around to test out the new movement afforded to the player. It made me wonder why there weren't areas to test out the differences in the Acro and Mach bikes in the original Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald. Funny how they addressed that in the very next installment. I would have rather they just turned it into a skate park or something though, because keeping the name but not the game is a little misleading. So now, let's return to a proper Safari Zone. I suppose now would be a good time to elaborate on something I said earlier. This video isn't really about Safari Zones, it's more about places with Safari games. As we just talked about, there's a place with the name but without the game. And as you probably know, there's a place with the game but not the name. Enter the Great Marsh, the Sinnoh region's addition to the Safari game roster. Located in swampy Pastoria City, the Great Marsh is just that. A swamp-turned-safari game. Whereas previous Safari Zones are savanna or plains themed, this one is all mud. There are 6 areas which can be traversed on foot, but you're better off using the tram to get around. It's a really cool addition and further sets the marsh apart. The step limit makes a return, and the mud can be difficult to navigate. You see, some tiles your character sinks into. You have to wiggle the D-pad to free yourself, and if that's on grass, it can take a few encounters just to move a few tiles. In Diamond and Pearl, these marshy trap tiles are indistinguishable from safe ones. In Platinum, the difference is a lot more stark. It's actually very frustrating to get around the Diamond and Pearl Great Marsh. Personally, I avoided it until Platinum came out. If you know where you're going though, and have more patience than a 7-year-old, you'll be okay. You also use mud here to increase the catch and flee rates rather than a rock or going near, which is quite on brand. Again, this place is a swamp. You're probably better off just throwing a Pokeball here though. I've seen some mixed discussion regarding whether or not bait is useful here. This Reddit post, which seems to check out, suggests using just a single bait on Pokemon that aren't prone to flee. For ones that are, just start tossing balls. Whiscash is the exception, because there's some sort of programming error that results in it lacking a proper flee chance. Instead, to my understanding, like the Gen 1 accuracy glitch, Whiscash can only flee if the random 0 to 254 inclusive random number generated at the end of a turn to determine if a Pokemon flees rolls a 0. Other than that, you're pretty much good, and if you're really worried, the post I mentioned recommends throwing 6 bait before starting to throw balls. I was curious and tested Whiscash's flee rate myself, and I tossed mud at it for 7 minutes before it fled. So you'll probably be fine to just throw a ball at it. What really sets the Great Marsh apart is that it has a rotating cast of Pokemon. What you can encounter changes every day. Each of the 6 areas has a 10% encounter slot that can be filled with rare Pokemon such as Carnivine and Skorupi. But some of the Pokemon on the random roster are ones that can already be found in the marsh, and you'd never know. For example, maybe this area has more Wooper than normal. Without a large enough sample size, you'd only be guessing. So how can you tell ahead of time? There's an observatory on the 2nd floor of the Great Marsh Gate with binoculars, leading to people calling these Pokemon binocular Pokemon. For a small fee, you get a random look at one Pokemon from each of the 6 areas. Mostly, it'll be Pokemon that are there every day. Do this enough though, and you'll probably notice something out of the ordinary. Match the glimpse you get to its location, and you've successfully tracked down a rotating binocular Pokemon. If you've got a good set, you can share these Pokemon with a friend, or another game, by mixing records. I myself found and caught a shiny Skorupi using this method last year, and I'm intending to head back for a shiny Carnivine sometime soon. Yeah, so what if I shiny hunt in the Safari Zone? That's just how tough I am. Something that I completely forgot about until recording footage for this video is that you can meet the grunt who blows up Lake Valor before he, blows up Lake Valor. I went on a Safari game while this man was looking for a place to explode. Fun stuff. The player character in Sinnoh has more in common with Seth MacFarlane than you may think. If you know, you know. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl didn't really shake up the formula in the same way other remakes have, which I'm grateful for. One remake I'm grateful did shake things up though, is Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, unlike their original versions, contain a Safari Zone. It's not in Fuchsia City, as was planned in Gold and Silver, but located in an entirely new area west of Cianwood City. It is amazing. It's the last wholly original Safari Zone we've seen, and wow, is it a strong note to end on. There are 150 different species to collect here. Yes, this one area contains about as many Pokemon as Red and Blue in their entirety. That's about a third of all the available Pokemon at the time. How the heck did they fit them all in one place? This Safari Zone is modular. There are 6 areas you can walk around and 12 different area types you can swap around to customize in whatever order you like. On top of that, in the post-game, you gain access to objects you can place down to attract more Pokemon. For example, to get Krabby to appear in the mountain area's grass, you need to place down 3 water objects. You're able to place down 30 objects in a single area at a time, which is where the waiting mechanic comes in. You may have heard that it can take up to 140 real-life days to see every Pokemon here. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's more or less true. You see, some Pokemon require more than 30 objects to be placed in order to appear, despite your cap being 30. For example, Beldum requires 63 peak objects in order for it to appear. Over time, objects appreciate and count for more than one. That's where the waiting comes in, because you need to wait a certain number of days for the objects to appreciate enough to attract your desired Pokemon. Thankfully, there are a few methods to bypass the wait, but you still need to do a little bit of legwork to figure out what you want. I'll link a guide below, but again, this is a post-game feature. Thankfully, if you have a friend with an ideal setup, you can share your zone with them at the right counter in the lobby. Sorry to all the friendless people in the audience. Some of the highlights of the Johto Safari Zone include Larvitar, Bagon, and Beldum. They're not Pokemon I would associate with Safari Balls at all, but by golly can you get them here. Over the years, I've found and lost 4 shiny Larvitar here. Wish me luck on number 5. Also of interest is how some of the Pokemon here had never been seen in the wild before. Riolu, for example, is a baby Pokemon that was only available through eggs. Due to Safari Zones having a tendency to have both Pokemon and their evolved forms, we can also catch odd middle stage Pokemon such as Shelgon, which wouldn't return until the Friend Safari in XY. More on that later. In some ways, the Johto Safari Zone can be seen as the opposite of the Hoenn Safari Zone. For example, its big ticket Pokemon are largely from Hoenn, and it was gained in a remake. Hoenn featured Johto Pokemon and was greatly reduced in a remake. Another big plus for the Johto Safari Zone is its lack of a step counter. You can stay here until you run out of Safari Balls, which is excellent due to the wide variety of Pokemon available. There is still an entrance fee though, and as far as I can tell, there's not major catching strategies like Hoenn or Kanto. Speaking of Kanto, the Warden is the one who introduces us to the Johto Safari Zone, where he's given the name Beoba. Over the course of his side quests, the player character becomes the new owner of the Safari Zone. I admit, knowing what we do about the Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire timeline, it makes me wonder if Beoba is attempting to shift responsibility in order to evade bankruptcy. As far as I know though, Warden Beoba is distinct from the Hoenn Warden, who we hear little about. If you're wondering how exactly the areas can be moved freely, welcome to my world. These two guys are right on the cusp of spilling the beans, but they say nothing concrete. Given how out of breath this one is though, I think maybe they're doing it somehow. Also, this is the only Safari Zone with no people inside, which is quite strange. Outside the zone, at the gate, there are all sorts of vendors and people excited about the Safari Zone, which makes it weirder that no one can go inside but you. Perhaps this is the player character exerting their power as owner, hogging all the rare Pokemon to themselves? In reality, I think this lack of people is due to the modular nature of the Johto Safari Zone. The idea of people within just doesn't sound right now that I think about it. Now though, it's time for an honorable mention. It's not a Safari Zone in any way. It just has Safari in the name, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention Kalos's Friend Safari. I have too much respect for my roots not to. You see, over 10 years ago, I dipped my toes into shiny hunting here in Kalude City's Friend Safari. There's not a Safari game here. Instead, each of the people on your 3DS's friends list is tied to a Friend Safari area with up to 3 Pokemon of the same type that you can enter to catch Pokemon normally. They have an increased chance to be shiny, have good IVs, and hidden abilities. Some of my first summer's shiny hunting were spent here in the Friend Safari, and honestly, I think it kind of gets a lot of unnecessary hate because of its semi-misleading name. If it was called the Friend Zone, or the Friend Fields or something, I'm sure it would have been better received. However, because they skipped a safari zone in Unova and dared to use the word safari in Kalos without letting us throw safari balls, I think it gets a bad rap. I don't really go much for shiny hunting that isn't at the legacy rate of 1 in 8,192, and the 3DS Wi-Fi is shut down, but I still like this area a lot in the year 2025. I'm considering spending a day or two hunting here just to see what I find, but not anytime soon. Which reminds me. And now we'll discuss whether or not a safari zone is in the future. I would really like one, and I don't think it's impossible, but honestly, I would be shocked if we ever got a new Safari Zone. For one, the last games with a wholly original Safari Zone are now old enough to drive cars. Surely we would have seen one by now if they were a priority, and the Johto Zone is rather final. Secondly, they'd be a little redundant nowadays. Pokemon Go's whole deal is that you can catch Pokemon without battling them, and they can and will flee. They actually have events called Safari Zones, and I was going to attend the one in St. Louis 5 years ago, but well, something got in the way of that. It can also be argued that the mechanics of the Safari Zone were also implemented into the main series if spin-offs aren't your thing. Since Sword and Shield, overworld Pokemon have been added as an occasionally antagonistic and sometimes skittish challenge to overcome. It's almost like an evolution of the Safari game, where instead of random encounters, you're seeking out Pokemon on a safari. Your actions, not your Pokemon's, can determine if you catch or lose a wild Pokemon. The only thing that would make this into a Safari game is if I was charged for it and I could only use Safari Balls. A zone dedicated to that would feel kind of silly nowadays. Honestly, as long as they keep implementing zone features into the main games, I would be okay without another Safari Zone. Something else that might disqualify future appearances are the receptions of past ones. Safari Zones aren't very casual friendly. Not at all. In researching this video, I've kind of noticed that people are split on Safari Zones. I've not seen this kind of division in sentiment anywhere else when it comes to Pokemon games. Some people, like me, love them. We consider them to be a nice change of pace and an interesting risk. People on the other side of the fence think it's a waste of time, and we should just get routes where we can battle Pokemon as normal. Why should they have to spend money to potentially see one of 5 pain in the rears they need for their Pokedex? I totally understand that perspective, especially now that catching methods have become so varied. It seems a little needless to fence off an area, charge for admission, and make you toss away all you've learned on your journey, and complaints only get more valid from there. For example, a criticism I've seen of the Johto Safari Zone is that it's incredibly bloated. It would take a long time for you to try to catch everything with no outside resources, and that's assuming you ever figured out that the Pokemon started changing over time. I guarantee you most kids just put some rocks down and left. That's what I did until my friend pulled out a strategy guide. This place relies on you knowing about its benefits before you even step foot in it. You pretty much need walkthroughs and strategy guides to catch everything you need for a complete Pokedex. There are just too many Pokemon here, but that's exactly why I like it, and why I like Safari Zones in general. I was a shiny hunter before I was a video essay lore man. I love variety, but I can see that's just my bias. Where I see targets, others see tedious boxes to check. My brain just works a little differently than that, and again, I recognize it. It's actually my shiny hunter brain that inspired me to make this video. You see, I fell in love with the Safari Zone because of Safari Week. If you didn't know, Safari Week is an annual event created by Pikachu Paradise and currently hosted by Absolblog's Pokemon, in which shiny hunters around the globe gather to hunt exclusively in the Safari Zone for a week. It's probably the biggest shiny hunting event of the year, and it's always a blast to participate. This year, it runs from June 20th to June 29th, which, if you didn't notice, means it starts today, right now. We're in it. I scheduled this video to upload a week ago, and I'm probably hunting right now. Please, take all I've taught you and go risk losing a shiny Pokemon in the Safari Zone. I realize that sounds crazy, and I didn't work up the courage to participate myself until 2021, but I promise that it's extremely fun. A shiny Pokemon feels so much more earned and special when you're able to so readily lose it. The Friend Safari and Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire Safari Zones don't count. It has to be a place with a Safari game. Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl are the most recent games to do that in, so if all you have is a Switch, don't despair. Just for the record, there are no prizes or anything. It's not that kind of event. This is purely for fun. It's just an excuse for the whole shiny hunting community to come together and be hunting the same stuff for a while. It's about camaraderie and togetherness. There's no pressure, just the thrill of the hunt. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I had a really fun time making this video. I actually only started scripting it at the beginning of June. My buddy Poker Rage AH asked me if I was making a video like this for my channel, and I was so surprised it hadn't crossed my mind. Here are his socials, so go give him some love. Here are mine also, and if you want to make sure I keep making stuff like this, please let me know by commenting, liking, and subscribing. If you're still listening, I'd love to hear which of the zones is your favorite. I'm still a little up in the air, so maybe I just need a push in the right direction. If you'll excuse me though, I need to go fail another shiny Larvitar.